Actually, Americans still don't trust Chinese technology. That sentence alone should stop you in your tracks, because the title promised the opposite. But here's the twist nobody saw coming. Not trusting something and not depending on it are two completely different things, and American industry has quietly slipped into the second one without ever agreeing to the first. For years, the story seems simple. Chinese phones, Chinese drones, Chinese apps, all treated as security threats first and products second. Americans saw Chinese technology as hard to trust because of national security fears, trade conflict, and recurring concerns about data access, surveillance, and intellectual property risk. That wasn't paranoia pulled from nowhere. Reuters has documented how restrictions on Chinese drones and telecom equipment were justified on national security grounds, even as companies like DJI fought back against bans on new models and components entering the American market. Even research groups that study the relationship closely, like CSIS, have argued that American and Chinese technology industries are deeply intertwined, but that the relationship still requires careful management because of concerns over technology transfer and security. So the headlines did what headlines do. Coverage focused on bans, export controls, and restricted entity lists rather than consumer appeal, which meant Chinese technology got framed less as a product category and more as a strategic risk. That's the world most viewers remember, a world where buying something Chinese felt like a small act of geopolitical risk. But somewhere between the ban lists and the sanctions, something started happening in the background that almost nobody was covering with the same intensity. And that's the real investigation tonight. Here's the golden fact of this entire story, the one detail hiding in plain sight. Even under mounting American restrictions, DJI reportedly still holds more than half of all commercial drone sales in the United States, while China accounts for roughly 85% of solar supply chain capacity and 80% of lithium-ion battery production capacity worldwide, along with 95% of polysilicon wafers and 97% of anode materials. Read that again, 97%. That's not a company winning a market, that's an entire industrial category with almost no alternative supplier on the planet. Think about the scale for a second. Imagine every battery cell in every electric car charging station in America, and imagine that almost every single raw material inside that cell, the anode, the wafer, the processed lithium, passed through a Chinese factory floor at some point before it ever reached American soil. That's not a hypothetical. That's roughly where the numbers sit today, according to reporting tied to the International Energy Agency. So how did a country that spent years building walls against Chinese tech end up this dependent on it? The answer isn't hypocrisy. It's economics moving faster than politics. Let's go back to the beginning of the wall building. Washington's national security logic wasn't invented out of thin air. Telecommunications equipment can carry data. Drones can capture imagery. Surveillance cameras can, in theory, phone home. Huawei became the face of that fear, remaining heavily restricted in American telecom and surveillance-related markets. And Reuters reported that regulators expanded bans on additional Chinese technology goods as recently as late June. Every restriction had a logic behind it, rooted in the idea that hardware touching sensitive networks is different from hardware sitting in a garage. That logic held firm in telecom, it held firm in surveillance, it even held firm, at least on paper, in the electric vehicle market. BYD, CATL, DJI, and Huawei became the clearest examples of a split between global success and American restriction, with Chinese electric vehicle brands winning enormous attention online while remaining effectively blocked from the American market by tariffs and policy barriers. On the surface, the wall looked like it was holding, but underneath that wall, a completely different economy kept running. Because while regulators were busy blocking finished products at the border, they weren't blocking the raw materials, the components, and the manufacturing capacity that sits several layers upstream, invisible to the average driver. China came to dominate major clean tech supply chain stages, including solar, lithium-ion batteries, wafers, and anode materials, which means many Americans now use Chinese origin technology indirectly through electric vehicle supply chains, grid storage, and solar installations, even when the visible brand on the product is American or European. That's the twist. You could buy an American-branded solar panel or a European-branded battery pack and still be participating in a Chinese industrial supply chain without ever knowing it. This is where the investigation really opens up, because this is the part almost nobody puts on camera. Reuters reporting on drones shows the same exact pattern, where even as restrictions intensify, existing authorized models remain in active use, and DJI continues to dominate the commercial market, which reveals a real distinction between direct adoption, meaning buying a Chinese branded product, and industrial dependence, meaning using Chinese-made parts, materials, or manufacturing equipment inside an American system. Those are two different battles, and America has only really been fighting one of them. Now picture that hidden dependence as an iceberg. The part above the waterline is the part everyone argues about. Banned apps, banned drone models, banned telecom equipment, all the visible, branded, headline-friendly fights. But the part below the waterline, the cells, the cathodes, the wafers, the magnets, the processing equipment, that's roughly 9/10 of the entire structure, sitting quietly out of view, doing most of the actual industrial work. And it's not just energy and drones. The pattern is spreading into entirely new categories. Unitree Robotics and DeepSeek represent a newer category entirely. Chinese artificial intelligence and robotics firms drawing attention for raw technical capability rather than broad American consumer adoption, with reporting indicating that Chinese robotics can gain real public visibility even as policymakers move to limit market access, while other reporting suggests American firms and startups are turning to Chinese technology in certain cases, more for practical use and benchmarking than out of mainstream consumer trust. That's a quieter kind of dependence, not a purchase decision made by a driver in a dealership, but a decision made by an engineer comparing performance numbers on a spreadsheet. So who's actually driving this if it's not consumer demand? That's an industry consensus worth sitting with for a moment. Across multiple independent sources, including Reuters, Bloomberg, CSIS, and IEA-linked reporting, the shared conclusion is that China has become indispensable inside key technology supply chains while remaining politically and commercially constrained in the American consumer market. Meaning the real strategic concern isn't just about Chinese-branded products entering America, but about American industry depending on Chinese capacity for batteries, solar, and critical components. In plain terms, the fight over branding was never the fight that mattered most. Here's where it gets genuinely uncomfortable for policymakers. A useful framing offered by industry analysts is that experts generally don't describe this as some kind of trust breakthrough between two countries. They describe it instead as a resilience and competition problem, where the United States may want to reduce its dependence, but the near-term replacement options are extremely limited. That's not a company statement. That's closer to an honest, unglamorous engineering assessment. You can't legislate a battery factory into existing overnight, and you definitely can't legislate 97% of global anode material production into a different country by executive order. Now, before this turns into a one-sided story about Chinese industrial dominance, let's be fair to the other half of the picture, because that's where the real trust gap still lives. Americans still strongly resist Chinese technology in sectors tied to data, surveillance, communications infrastructure, and connected vehicles. And Reuters reports ongoing and expanded restrictions from federal regulators on Chinese telecom and surveillance equipment, along with bans on new Chinese drone models and components, which remain the clearest examples where public trust and government policy stay firmly aligned against adoption. This isn't a country that opened its doors, it's a country that closed some doors deliberately, while other doors quietly stayed open because closing them wasn't economically possible. And that split isn't random. The strongest resistance remains concentrated exactly where people fear invisible access: in microphones, cameras, network devices, cloud-connected systems, and vehicles capable of transmitting location or operational data. Because in those categories, being cheap and good has not yet been enough to overcome the perception of being too risky. That line right there might be the cleanest way to explain the entire phenomenon. Price and performance can win almost any market except the one built on fear of being watched. There's a consumer angle here too, and it's genuinely fascinating on its own. Reporting shows Americans are increasingly drawn to Chinese electric vehicles online because of price and technology appeal, even though actual sales inside the United States remain largely blocked, which is a meaningful sign of shifting perception, but is not the same thing as mass purchase behavior happening inside the American market. So there's genuine curiosity building underneath the policy wall. People are watching video reviews, comparing specs, admiring the technology, all while the product itself sits legally out of reach. Interest is sprinting ahead of access, and that gap is only going to get more interesting to watch. So here's the question worth sitting with, because it doesn't have a comfortable answer. How exactly does a country reduce its dependence on the very technology that's currently helping keep its own economy moving forward? You can't simply unplug from a supply chain that supplies the majority of your solar panels and batteries without a real transition plan. And that transition plan doesn't exist yet at the scale required. Is this something that gets solved through new domestic factories over the next decade? Or is dependence simply the new normal that nobody wants to say out loud? Drop your take in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of question the industry itself hasn't fully answered. Let's bring this back to the title, because that's really what everyone came here to find out. Did Americans finally accept Chinese technology? The honest answer is that Americans have begun accepting some Chinese technology, but mostly indirectly and selectively. And the bigger truth underneath that is the United States is becoming economically dependent on Chinese technology faster than it is becoming socially comfortable with it. Two different clocks running at two very different speeds, and the industrial one is winning. So the title is only partly true. What actually happened was never a full change of heart, it was a widening gap between public acceptance of Chinese consumer brands and the real-world dependence on Chinese manufacturing, components, and materials. Americans didn't fall in love with Chinese phones or Chinese drones sitting on store shelves. They just ended up standing on a supply chain they never fully saw. One battery, one solar wafer, one processed material at a time. And that's really the uncomfortable part of this entire investigation. The change didn't happen in a store. It happened in a factory nobody was filming, inside a supply chain most drivers will never think about, sitting quietly underneath the cars, the solar panels, and the batteries people trust every single day. So to not get caught off guard by what's coming next in this industry, join us here, because the next shift probably won't happen on a showroom floor either. It'll happen somewhere in the supply chain again, long before anyone notices.